Good morning. This is Michael Smith, and I have debated for some time about doing this video and talking to you about current affairs and things that are going on in the country and in our churches and in our personal lives that are very disconcerting, and to let you think about some things that maybe from my perspective might be a bit different. Those of you that know me probably have preconceived ideas about where I stand on various issues. And I have to tell you that that journey has been a long one. I started out in Christian fundamentalism as a kid and began church in those churches and moved to, from that to Independent Baptist to Southern Baptist, and now much more progressive Baptist than where I started. And I really want you to know that it's all right for your opinions to change as you grow older, because you become much wiser and much more attuned to, I think, what is the voice of God. Religion as an institution is not a good fit with humanity, I don't think, because we get caught up in these tangents that lead us off into things that probably as Christians we have no business being in. I will say wholeheartedly that the 1980s probably were the best years of my religious life as a pastor, as a teacher, as a missionary, working in all those fields and doing the things that I've done. My experience is quite extensive, and that I have been in a lot of different fields. There's never been the one thing I do. It's the 15 things that I dabble in, as one of my deacons told me once. But when I get into the present day, I am really troubled and bothered by many things that I see. And one of those is the fact of mixing religion and politics. We always held such a hard line against mixing the two until, we got more caught up in cultural issues than we do the spreading of the gospel. And so it led to this unholy alliance, as I call it, between the Christian church and Republican Party, making it the party of God. As a historian, my area of expertise is American religious history, and I've studied it extensively and tried to write some things about that from the early days, from the Puritans well up to the present, and especially Christian fundamentalism, which was one of the areas that I'm most interested in. And we always held such a hard line between church and state, as Thomas Jefferson, who probably wouldn't be a believer in the sense that we would think of him today as a believer today. He would not be a evangelical or a fundamentalist, but he had very strong ideas because he saw some of the things that would happen if we yoked the church and the government together in one and had a state church. And now we've come back to that same situation in which we have filled the Supreme Court with ideologues. And I've said all along that we are much better as a country when the Supreme Court is a centrist organization that makes decisions for every side of the issue, and we come out with a pretty balanced result. And that has been the case until recent years. Recently, the Roe v. Wade decision being overturned is causing great consternation, as well as it should, even among Christians. And not only am I concerned about Christians being caught up in politics where they have no business. As a pastor, I had a politician visit my church one Sunday, and he brought a singer with him. Of course, the singer would get up and make some political announcement, and then he would shake hands afterwards. And I didn't let the guy sing. I didn't let him make his announcement. And I asked the politician at the end of the service to please cross the church property line. If he wanted to stand there and talk to people about politics, it was fine, but there's no place in the church for me having politicians in, regardless of whether they are pro-abortion, pro-life, or whatever. We have no business mingling religion with politics. And I say that without apology. I'm not here to argue that point. I have watched it for 65 years, and I'm more determined today and in that position than I have ever been. So I'm very distraught at the church. As the African-American pastor at the Southern Baptist Convention in the past 2 weeks preached a message and said that the Southern Baptist Church had become the whore of Donald Trump. And that's really true. We have become the handmaiden of Republican politics. And that doesn't mean we don't vote. but it does mean we don't tell our people how to vote. And I did that as a pastor for my entire life. I encouraged my people to vote. They never knew how I voted, and I didn't care to know how they voted. That is freedom. That is not me passing out voter guides and telling people how they should vote. There's a whole host of cultural issues involved in this, and some of it's LGBT rights, women's rights, minority rights, and we're about to see all of the advances that were made through the 1960s and 70s, which I lived through. We're about to see all of that upended, and this country go into a civil war or something very close to it. In this day, there are many more ways to wage war than just taking a gun and going out into the battlefield. And we've reached that point where the warfare has become physical with guns, but ideologically, we wage war and do it on many different terms. The church is no place for that. The model church, the church that we should be adhering to, is a church that preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ, that loves people. And the church has lost its ability to love and to care only for those people that match them ideologically. I mean, the church should be a place where anyone can come and worship. And if you differ in beliefs, that's okay. You can get along without everybody crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And so I'm very concerned about the future of the church. I'm also concerned now about our democracy, because I believe, as someone has said recently, that within 10 years, we probably won't have a democracy anymore. I can say this as a 65-year-old because I've watched this and I've studied it now most of my adult life, and I've taught students all over the country about the freedoms that are invested in America. I've studied the founding fathers, and I've studied early preachers and early religion, and I realized that they functioned best when they kept that line of separation between church and state that was started in the beginning with the first Constitution. So we have some very real concerns. I'm concerned about our children, not only their safety in schools. It appalls me when our elected leaders are more concerned about gun rights than they are protecting children's lives. It concerns me when we're more concerned about keeping a woman from an abortion than we are protecting our children that are born and making sure they have the best education and the best potential to become American citizens. And I'm sorry to tell you, I don't believe the church cares anymore about human life. I've watched it since 1973. I worked in early days with the Moral Majority and many others. I know these people. I know their motivations. And I'm telling you that for the most part, it is more about fundraising and getting people to rally to their point of view and their side and some candidate side than it is about protecting the life of the unborn or the life of those that are born. It is just smoke and mirrors. Recently, the Southern Baptist Convention met, and in the face of a report where they have covered up sexual abuse of their ministers and their administration people and moved them around the churches and kept them in positions of pastoral leadership without any punishment or withdrawal or banning them from functioning, they relatively ignored the report at their biggest convention. No address was made to try to correct problems because they don't want to correct problems. And yet they can attack the Catholic Church for their, pedophile priest problem or whatever, but they're exactly in the same line with the Catholic Church. If you don't make corrections and fix your problems and you ignore them and bury your head in the sand, you're guilty. And so it's a crying shame. A lot of this goes back to how in the Baptist Church women are treated. They are not allowed in places of leadership. They still operate off of that old mantra where they blame women for the sin of Eve and deceiving Adam in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. Women have never been allowed to be ministers or deacons or lead, and yet they do most of the work in the average church, but they get no credit for it at all. I was amazed in 1998 when the Southern Baptists came out with their Baptist Faith and Message again, that they reiterated that position that if a woman wanted to ask a question, she needed to ask her husband at home and not speak in a mixed congregation. I've seen that most of my life. I've seen churches where women were not even allowed to teach a children's Sunday school class that had both males and females. I've seen this over and over. And I'm telling you that that is wrong at its very onset. The way we treat women in our churches are shame. And I'm amazed that women, if they are not deluded or brainwashed, would stay there. I mean, we have a lady on the Supreme Court that believes in this, you know, your husband tells you what to do and you ask him at home and you have as many children as he wants to have. And, you know, I saw a lady recently at the dentist office that had 8 children, 10 and under, and was looking to have more. And I thought, well, that's fine. That's well and good. That's your freedom. That's your right. But don't push that on someone else. And she homeschools them and she does all of those things because, you know, trying to protect them from the world. That goes back to an old debate we had when I was a teenager in fundamentalism, that you take your children and you put them in hothouses like Christian universities and Christian schools, and you keep them from the world and you keep them from being, you know, tarnished by sin and Satan and all those things. And let me tell you something, that did not work. There were very few Christian schools that supplied education. They might have supplied other things. I worked in one for 12 years. I know the limitations, and I know that we are sacrificing our children's ability to survive in the world by not giving them the education that they need. So it concerns me that our democracy has reached the point to where we have a senator, a lady yesterday, who said of Donald Trump that his administration had saved the white society, that we're such racists. And I'm here to tell you that's another problem that I have with Baptists in particular and Christianity in general, is that we still are steeped in racism. The whitest place on the face of the earth on Sunday morning is a Baptist church, and we make no efforts to make a change. 1995, Southern Baptists apologized for their role in slavery and racism, and I know that role well because I've studied it extensively. You realize that since 1995, go back and look at the statistics of how few African-American churches or people have gone into Southern Baptist churches since 1995. It's probably less than half of 1%. And yet Southern Baptists still send millions of dollars to Africa to win people there that they won't walk across the street and win here because they don't want them in their churches. I also have to address the modern idea of worship. I'm much more like Vance Havner, the old preacher who said that, you know, we don't need God anymore in our services because we have learned to the act of strange fire. We can, we can mimic worship. We can mimic the work of the Holy Spirit. And the sad thing is, in most of our churches, the Holy Spirit wrote Ichabod over the door and departed a long time ago. The sad thing is, so many Christians aren't even spiritually savvy enough to realize that the Holy Spirit has departed, because the fake is almost as convincing as the real, and the fake will deceive many who are unsaved in our churches. And so they think everything's all right. Let me say that very plainly. Everything is not all right with our churches. They are not what they used to be. And of course, I'm not one of those that always looks back to the past. I'm very much for change. I think there's a difference in change in ideas. We tend to treat biblical teachings much like we want to treat the Constitution, that it is invalid, it's not discernible. You have to go back and you have to live by that version in 1789 of the Constitution, and we have to live by that for most Baptists, in particular, the 1611 King James Bible, which that's a whole story into itself, and I'll not argue that point. But there has to be change with culture and change with time, and we have to read the Bible through 2022 lens sometimes to understand that you cannot apply the lens of 1611 to 2022 and make any sense out of our belief about the Bible. I know for many of you that's treason, and those of you that know me and know my past probably are surprised that I've come to these positions, but let me tell you something. We as Christians are failing. We are failing the world that we live in, and let me tell you, we have traded our religious freedom for a mess of pottage, much like they did in the Old Testament, where Esau traded his birthright to Jacob for breakfast. and we've traded for a lot less. We've sold out the church of Christ to politics and to religion. And then we come in with our imprimatur and say, oh, it's all right to vote for this guy. He's a Christian. 3 preachers put their hands on a man and said, oh, he's a Christian. We can vote for him. I will not name them. But let me tell you something. The wheels of God's justice grind slowly, but they grind thoroughly. And those 3 men are deceivers, and they will continue to deceive and put a man in office who wouldn't know God if he ran over him with a bus. And now we still hold up for him. I don't care who any man is. If you hold up for him in your church and encourage your people to vote for them by name, you have a problem with biblical truth. And that is not the way God intended the church to be. We are not a political entity. I remind you that the Roman society made Christianity their official religion in 391 under Theodosius, and with 75 years they fell. And most people blame that change in the church taking over the politics of religion. For hundreds of years, they had followed pagan beliefs and pagan practices, and they'd excelled and been blessed. But let church people, let bishops and priests and preachers take over the running of a country, and they fall into the dustbin of history. This is where America is headed if we don't change our perspective and we don't look a little more and get back to where we fell from. You remember the story of the axe head in the Old Testament, where the sons of the prophets decided that Elijah's place was too straight for them, and so they go out and going to clean them off a spot and build them their own little preacher's place. And so while they borrow an axe head, they're cutting away, and the axe head falls into the river, and they can't get it back. And they have to go back to the old man of God, the one that always looked to the past and always said, you know, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And they had to bring him, and they tell him their plight, that they've lost this axe head, that's expensive. And his words were these: take me to the place where you lost it. And I'm a firm believer that we have to come back to the place where we have lost our higher ground, our moral ground as Christians. Come back to the place, seek out the old paths and walk therein. That doesn't mean that we have to go back to being Puritans and wearing belt buckles and gray clothing. It means we have to come back to our senses when it comes to dividing church and state and religion and politics, and even to be a little bit more forgiving. We run more people out of our churches today than we bring in. And it's all about how we behave and how we act on these issues, cultural issues. We need to love everyone regardless of who they are, what they believe, what they think. And it is our duty as Christians to minister to them and love them. And we need to reread sometimes the book of Jude. We don't have to agree with everyone in order to minister to them. In fact, that's all we're doing today. We are rearranging the chairs on the Titanic while the ship is going down. And we're impervious to the fact that there are people out there that need our ministry that we may not agree with. Even Jude said, you don't have to agree with them. You can pull them from the fire, hating even the garments spotted by the flesh. But it's our duty as Christians. So I'm not sure how you will perceive this recording today. I really don't care. I don't need to be corrected. I don't need to be argued with. I do need the power and the presence of God on my life. And my calling is to speak the truth in love. And so I'm very much concerned with church today as it is. I'm concerned with our political involvement. I'm concerned with us as people, because you're killing people with your attitudes. You're killing people with your actions, and you're not loving people as you're commanded. And so as a church, we need to rise up and say, enough of this. Let's come back. Let's come back to let's get out of politics. Let's stop endorsing characters that aren't Christians. The Bible does say, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, does it not? So how can you endorse political candidates that just because they meet your social issues, they don't have to meet your religious standard? And so we get in bed with all kinds of unsavory characters and then refuse to believe that they could possibly do wrong. I really believe that we have misinterpreted the scriptures in Thessalonians that as Baptists, we always equated with the period after the rapture and before the revelation that said in that day that strong delusion would be sent on the land that people would believe a lie and be damned. I believe that strong delusion is here. How else do you explain Christians who refuse to believe truth, who will believe a lie and believe it to their destruction, to the point that they will become a mob and will attack the institutions of government that they have long upheld, that have functioned for us for over 300 years, and suddenly the Messiah comes along and his false prophet, and we join his side. That, my friend, is strong delusion. And you've done the same thing that Antiochus Epiphanes did in the Jewish temple when you slaughter a pig on their altar, when you raise an idol to any man, no matter who he is, even a preacher or a politician. When you raise an idol in a church to be worshiped and adored, I watched a political thing in a church in Dallas recently, and when the man who I won't name came in, they literally did everything but lick his shoes. He is not God. He is not Jesus Christ. He's an antichrist when we do that. So we need to be very careful about how we treat others, how we love others. John, in his latter years, who had been boiled in oil and put out on Patmos, and you can imagine there's just a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean, and how painful that would have been to be boiled in oil and stuck out in the hot sun with no shade. And there he wrote the book of Revelation. But in his final years, he was so old that they had to carry him to church in a litter. And he was so weak that all he could say was, brethren, love one another. Love one another. Love one another. I'm afraid that the Christian church today has little or nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Much like we talk about Native American images being used in baseball and other sports as a token, Jesus has become a token to the Christian church. We plaster his face on the wall and we do what we want to do, but we don't love each other, which was the very central theme of Christianity. Well, so much for my soapbox today. I hope that maybe some of you might change your direction. Evangelist Billy Kelly, years ago, some of you will know him. The lady came down the aisle and she said, preacher, she said, you rubbed my kitty the wrong way. He said, well, sister, then turn your cat around. And that would be my admonition to you. If this rubs you the wrong way, at least think about your position and maybe turn around before it's too late, because I think we are very quickly coming, if we have not already passed, the point of no return. And that's going to be sad for America, but what do you think it's going to mean for the rest of the world, who looks to us as a beacon of Christianity, a beacon of freedom, a beacon of political truth? And the great will be the fall, when America is taken over by other powers. When there's a vacuum left, these people you see that attacked Washington on January the 6th will be those in control. Do you really want to be ruled by armed mobs? But that's where we're headed if we're not very careful in what we do in the days to come. Thank you so much, and I appreciate you listening.